should be on the bottom of the screen.
Okay, there we go. All right, friends, welcome to another Tuesday night little summer tour of Ratio Christi Winthrop. We've put together several different talks that we've been doing over the last several weeks, and we started off actually with a good dialogue between our speaker tonight, Nathan Taylor, and actually a good friend joining us tonight, Mr. Glenn. I'm not even going to attempt the last name because I'll murder it, but on Sola Scriptura. And then from there, we did a talk on why Christians should study philosophy. Then we did a talk on critical race theory, which got all kind of attention. And people called us for days about that. And so we're continuing tonight. We're doing a talk. We invited our friend Nate Taylor back. He's let him tell you a little bit more about himself, but went to Biola and has a degree in philosophy as well as MDiv from Westminster Theological Seminary. He's going to be speaking tonight about the ontological argument. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to him, and he is going to give the talk, and he's just going to kind of determine the format. I think he's going to break it up. And so for those who are on the discussion, if you guys have questions and that, he's going to let you guys kind of ask some questions during the talk rather than keep it towards the end, because it can be kind of a difficult subject. So Nate, if you want to tell people kind of who you are, where they can follow you and read your stuff and listen to your sermons, and I'm just going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Devin. I appreciate that, and thank you both for having me, Devin and Melissa, for this talk or discussion or whatever you want to call it. So I'm Nate. I'm the pastor of Corner Canyon Church, and been married to my wife Laura for 6 years, and we have 2 beautiful but rambunctious children. They're young, and so I was laughing when you guys were dealing with yours, because that's a very similar experience. My wife's like, should I go upstairs and play? Go up and try to play some TV for them so they can be preoccupied for this time. So
that's so funny of us knowing you guys back from when I think you were engaged, or yeah. We knew you, but then we met Laura, and then now you're married. Now 2 kids. That's so cool.
I know, time flies.
Yeah.
I know, they grow so fast, and it's amazing to see the time go by.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm the pastor at Corner Canyon Church in Draper, Utah. I forgot to almost mention that last time, and I've been ministering there for about 4 years, I think it is now. So we love Utah and the people here, and it's really been a blessing. And I study philosophy. It's still a labor of love, and I used to work on free will a little bit, but now I just mostly think about arguments for God's existence. That's mostly what I think about a lot of the time and study. So I actually titled this talk, The Ontological Argument, the most important argument for the existence of God. And, that is a very confident and ambitious title, very flamboyant title, or I don't know if that's the right word to use for it. A very, intense title for it, especially since Melissa said this is the one that makes me feel the most uneasy. And my wife commenting on this one, she's like, oh, wow, I can't believe you titled it that, the ontological argument. That argument is weird. So what are you thinking titling it that, Nate? And the reason why that is because a lot of people tend to either not understand the argument, or they think it's completely unpersuasive. And so for those reasons, this argument has been relegated to the back of the line, if I can use that expression, of the theistic arguments. But I want to say that this argument is of the most, if not the most important argument for the existence of God. It may not be the most persuasive necessarily to everybody, but I think it's one of the most important arguments, or as I said, the most important really for rhetorical flourish. So why do I say that? Well, because the ontological argument provides the bridge from the general idea to God to specifically the Christian God. That's to say, philosophers and scientists will talk about the God of the philosophers, and how that doesn't connect up into any major worldview. And I want to say the ontological argument specifically gets us to the Christian God. That might be upsetting for people that are really into presuppositional apologetics and think that transcendental arguments are really going to get you down with the Christian God. How upsetting it is for people like that who, find out that it's a classical argument that actually gets you to the existence of the Christian God. And so that's, it can even narrow it down, possibly even down to denominations. That's how helpful I think this argument is to getting us a really robust and clear biblical understanding of God. And I think we're going to see how this God, proven by the ontological argument, lines up perfectly with what I believe to be the biblical conception of God. And so, there are a lot of versions of the ontological argument that are out there, just like there are a lot of conceptions of the cosmological arguments that are out there. I tend to think all of the arguments are generally successful, of the ontological and the cosmological. But, and generally speaking, the ontological arguments argue from the concept of God to his existence. The one I'll be looking at is I've been encouraged to go with this one more than ever, and I think it is the most powerful one. But this one argues from the possibility of God's existence to his actual existence. So it's been dubbed the modal ontological argument. We're going to get more into that. And so I do think, though, for the record, that the original ontological argument, if I can use that expression, developed by Anselm in the 11th century, I even think that one works. I've developed a interesting defense of that one without diving into modal categories, but I think that argument's been mostly abandoned because people want to go into whether it's possible or impossible if God exists. And so, but this type of argument I'll be looking at, this modal ontological argument, arguing from the possibility of God's existence to his actual existence. This has been defended by many theists working in philosophy of religion, such as Alvin Plantinga. J.P. Moreland, I know, defends a version of this. William Lane Craig and many, many others defend a modal ontological argument. And so before we can even get into the argument, I think this will be so helpful for us, because if I just start, throwing out possible worlds or possibility, impossibility, contingency, necessity, you'll be like, well, what's going on? I'm thinking about what I'm doing later on or something. You're just going to lose where I'm headed towards. So I want to define some terms here quickly so that we can better understand the argument. Once I define these terms, my hope and my prayer is that the rest of the argument just falls into place and you get all of it. That's my hope. And then before we even get into the argument, I'm going to ask y'all for questions, just so you understand what I'm talking about. And I think these are intuitive terms once we grasp what I'm talking about, and it'll help us. So yeah, modality. When I say the modal ontological argument, this is just a fancy word for talking about possibility, impossibility, what's possible, what's not possible, right? So that's what I refer to, and that's what I'll be using modal that entire way throughout the discussion. And I'm going to be using language of possible worlds. Now, the problem with this language is it's extremely helpful in using semantics and talking about what's possible and impossible. However, once you start talking about possible worlds, there is this tendency to think you're talking about real existing worlds like the multiverse, or that there's actually real worlds out there existing. And so if I say there's a possible world where there's a pink unicorn, my daughter's into My Little Ponies right now, so it's fresh in the mind. So if I talk about a possible world where there's a pink unicorn, people are like, oh, you said possible world, so that means that sucker doesn't exist, right? Something like that. And that's not what I'm saying. That is not. It's a helpful way of explaining possibility and impossibility. So and it helps us conceptualize it easier. So I'm not trying to speak like a Star Trek or Star Wars character when I say possible world, like they actually exist. So when I say that there is a possible world where I never become a pastor, I'm not communicating it's real. What I am saying is that there could have been a maximal way things could have been to where I was never a pastor. So things could have turned out, and it's an entirety. things could have turned out in its entirety in a maximal way where I never become a pastor as I am right now, right? That's what I mean by possible world. It's a maximal way. It's a maximal way things could have been. God could have created it to where I never got married. I was a bachelor for the rest of my life, something like that, right? So that's a maximal way things could have been. I don't mean it as actually existing now. And God could have created a world, or a world could have turned out that way. I guess I should just so I'm going to be cautious here. Does anybody have no idea what I'm saying yet? Just on what I mean by possible world. Okay, well, if nobody wants to jump in, and if you work up the gumption later on to jump in, feel free to if you need clarification.
I actually did have one quick question. So do you think that I'm just purely being speculative here. So do you think that another way you could say is like a possible reality? So I feel like, I don't know, part of me thinks that like a possible world could get a little confusing if they think like as in like planet Earth or something, as opposed to like how reality is. Do you think like
I guess it's not a reality in that sense. It's not world is it's confusing. I guess either way is confusing, right?
Yeah, but do you understand how like saying possible world?
Yeah.
You understand like possible world might be confusing for the person who hears it. That
reality.
You think. I'm like wondering if like that might be kind of like overcome that hurdle, like that way you don't even have to like address like or that clarification, like a possible way reality could have been. I don't know.
To be honest with you, I don't think that sounds terribly bad. World communicates the more holistic aspect of it. That's why the world is used. Maybe you could say universe, but then you start thinking of the multiverse.
Yeah.
It's just, oftentimes in conversations, you're just struggling to understand the language and everything.
That's the purpose for what I was asking.
Yeah, but that you said possible reality, a possible way reality could have been in its entirety. Yeah. Is an indication to me that you're getting what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Is the term possible outcomes also a synonym for what you're saying, or is that off base there?
Outcome. I guess you could say outcome, right? Because it's talking about everything in its entirety, right? Outcome more stresses end result, Tyler. So outcome sounds like a result, whereas we want to talk about everything simultaneously.
Okay, cool.
Oh yeah, I like that. So yeah, you could say a possible. Someone just put in the chat like a possible maximum circumstance. Like it's a maximalization of all the circumstances, right? So everything that happens in this reality, things could have been differently. God could have made things differently. It could have turned out differently, right? So I think you guys, that you are asking these questions leads me to believe that all of you are getting what I'm saying, which is really good. Because I've heard, I was listening to Craig just the other day, and he was teaching the class on this, and there was a gentleman who just never could get it, like literally the whole time. And I was like, oh, I hope that doesn't happen to me, So I think we want to stress, that you guys are getting the concept of max way things possibly could have been, I think you guys are getting a maximal set of circumstances combined, right? About how everything could have been, right? So yes, I'm encouraged by this thus far. And so when I say that there is a possible world where I could have hated Mexican food, I currently quite enjoy Mexican food. I'm just meaning to say there's a maximal way things could have turned out to where I end up hating Mexican food. And so for something to be possible, right? When I say it's possible that, right? I'm not speaking a physical possibility. I'm just saying there's a max possible way things could have turned out. And in one way, in one of those possible worlds, just one, it ended up being true, right? Just one. For it to be possible, it just needs to be true in one possible world. For it to be possible, not 5, 6, or whatever it is, just one for it to be possible, right? That's kind of the minimalistic way of putting it. And so it's kind of as a segue for this, when I say something exists contingently, like I exist contingently, that is to say that I exist in at least one possible world. So to exist contingently. So all physical things like my iPhone here, like these are all contingent things. Every physical thing that you can think of typically by philosophers is viewed as contingent, because it just could be that the Big Bang never expanded or God didn't create, right? However way you want to think of it, right? So the Big Bang on most naturalistic scientific views, it could have not happened. Or in the theistic Christian view, God could not have created. God could have just enjoyed his inner Trinitarian love from all eternity in that state. So God could not have created. So all physical things, because of this, are viewed as contingent, meaning they are at least, they're not possibly true in every world. They're true in at least one world. They could have not have existed, basically. As much as I hate to think, I could have not existed. I am a contingent being. So did everybody understand that terminology so far? Okay, good. It seems like we are on the right track here. So that's why I say physical things are contingent, and that means they're obviously possible, but they could have not have existed, right? There are possible worlds where God doesn't create, right? And so if something is impossible, so this is the polar opposite here. If something is impossible, there is no possible world. There's zero, zilch, not nada, where it exists. An example of an impossible thing: a square circle, a married bachelor, right? An object which is red all over and green all over, right? That's not possible, right? So those are examples of, or like a logical contradiction, right? Those are examples of things which are impossible. They're not true in any possible way. Things could have turned out, maximally speaking. There's just no way they could ever exist. That's a good way of putting it. There's no way they could ever exist. One example that Alvin Plantinga gives is that it's impossible that the prime minister be a prime number, because of course a prime number is an abstract conceptual thing, or a form, depending on how you want to think of it, and a prime minister is a flesh and blood human being, and so an abstract thing can't be a concrete thing, so it's impossible that the prime minister, it's kind of there's just, don't get confused by the two primes there. A prime minister can be a prime number, right? Like I'm not the number one, right? I might be first place in something, but I don't represent, if you got rid of me, the number one would still exist, right? That's what I mean to say. So a prime minister can't be a prime number, is what Alvin Plantinga said. There's other funny examples of things that are just impossible. I'm sure you could think of them that are just inherently contradictory. Some might say an atheist minister, though there's a denomination that actually has an atheist minister, so maybe I shouldn't say that. Anyways, I'm getting sidetracked here. So the last category, and this one's crucially important for understanding the argument, stay focused on this one, is a necessary truth or a necessary thing there. So a necessary truth, or a thing, if we say something is necessary existence, it exists in every max possible state, right? It's in every maximal way things could have been. This thing or this proposition would be true, right? So it's in every possible world, they say. If something is necessary just in case it exists in every possible world, something is impossible just in case there's no possible world in which it exists. So I hope you guys are tracking with me. Things that are conceived of as necessary would be things like many philosophers think that numbers like abstract objects, like number one exists, number two exists, that would be a necessary thing, or moral goodness, moral truths, truths like it's immoral to murder babies for fun. That seems like that's necessarily true. That is a horrendous thing. Logical truths are also viewed as necessary truths. Truths like every proposition is either true or false, or a proposition cannot be both true and false. Those are viewed as necessary truths in philosophy. And so this is now where the ontological argument comes into play a little bit here. We're going to lead up to it, kind of ease ourselves into it. So any questions of comprehension that I've said thus far?
So is checking for logical contradictions the main way you determine if something is possible? Or are there other ways for things to be impossible other than it contradicting itself?
Well, some things are just base modal intuitions, right? Like we understand just intuitively, right, that an object can't be red and blue all over. So on a certain level, it just comes down to intuition. That understanding certain concepts, understanding those concepts are incompatible, or to put it this way. And so kind of, yeah, in some ways, right? And also there's another test people use, which is conceivability. If you can conceive of it, it's thought of as somewhat of a guide, all things being equal, meaning it can be defeated by other considerations. But it's thought that if you can conceive of something, then that provides at least initial grounds to think that it's possible. You can conceive of it, basically. So yeah, those are some ways looking to what actually happens. If you know if something is actually the case, and you know it's possibly the case, right? Could happen, because this is definitely in this world is actual, but it's also possible, right? So another world could have been selected. God could have created something else. So conceivability, and yeah, looking for logical coherence, and other things you hold to in your view of reality. All of those come into play when you're determining what's possible or impossible. That makes sense?
Thanks.
So I have a question. So this is kind of hypothetical. So would you commit yourself to the idea that things like abstract objects and like numbers and propositions actually do exist? Because you would commit yourself to that. So
I'm sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead.
Oh no, you're good. I was just gonna say, because I know William Craig argues that like if you believe those things do exist, and that brings into question God's aseity. So, and I think like wouldn't part of being maximally great also involve being like self-existent in that way? So would you say that like in that way those things don't exist? And if these things don't exist, then we wouldn't really have anything necessary, and unless God existed. And so to say that like things necessarily existed would kind of have to assume God's existence. Did that make any sense? Sort of.
Oh no, it does. It sounds like you're thinking through this pretty well. There are philosophers that do hold to necessary truths existing by resulting in God's mental activity. There's views that say that numbers and propositions and the like are independent of God. The Christian theists hold that. I hold to Craig. I would agree with some of Craig's arguments, because I would go the different way. I would say abstract objects are grounded in the mind of God. So oneness is a necessary thought that God has, is what I would say.
Gotcha. Okay.
So yeah, but they're different Christian philosophers that hold different things. But that is where I go. So I would hold to that radical view of God's aseity, given that he is the greatest conceivable or greatest possible being.
But still believing that those things those things do exist at the same time. Okay.
Yeah, I do. In God's mind, moral truths, logic, all those things I think are grounded in God's mental states. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's a good question. Yeah. Any others wanna?
I heard in the beginning, talking about parallel universes and stuff. So, does that?
They're not. But just be clear, they're not parallel universes. They don't actually exist.
Okay.
They're just ways God could have made it different. Where right now, Glenn, you're not wearing that hat. You're wearing another hat. God could have made reality different. They're not parallel universes.
Oh, so they're different realities?
They're different ways reality could have been.
I see.
Yeah.
I see. So, so my question would be then, why do we live in this reality, in this way, how all things have turned out instead of it going the other way?
Yeah, my answer to that is God made a free decision to actualize this world. He could have actualized a different world, but he so chose to actualize this one. He could have actualized a world where you're not wearing that hat right now, or that you had a casserole for lunch or something. So he could have made things that way, right? So I think my answer is going to be different than an atheistic answer. I'm going to say God actualized that world and explains it. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
So did we say possible worlds are just purely conceptual things?
Well, I would, because I would say I ground them in the mind of God. But other people would say that they're sets of propositions. There was a guy, Lewis, who actually held that possible worlds did exist. And there's actually, isolated existent realms where there's flying pigs and so on. But I would say, some would say propositions, some would say concepts. I would put them in the concept of I would put them as concepts in God's mind personally. But yeah, that's getting into like the metaphysical weeds of all of this. So yeah, but that's an interesting question. Yeah.
Do you take possible world semantics to be an account for all modal claims? Like, is it some kind of account for those kinds of claims?
Oh, I would say it's a device that helps clarify modal claims.
So it's not. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, you're fine. Go ahead.
Okay, so it's more a conceptual framework for thinking through modal problems, more so than some kind of account.
Right. Well, yeah, it's kind of a semantic. It helps you understand the modal claims we're making, and helps modal logic, helps us to understand modal logic and the claims we're making about what's possible or impossible. Yeah. So that's a great question.
All right, thanks.
Yeah. So yeah, if there's no others, these are just incredibly thought questions. I appreciate them. So yeah, just to start thinking about this. So what we as someone's a Christian, a Muslim, or an adherent to Judaism, would they say God exists necessarily or contingently? Does God happen to exist, or does God have to exist? Does God exist in every possibility, or are there possibilities in which God does not exist? A maximal state of like possibility, right? That we're kind of robust notion that we're trying to bring up with possible world speech. So yeah, does God happen to exist, or does he have to exist? Does God necessarily exist or contingently exist? And there we kind of come butting up against the modal ontological argument, because God, for the vast majority of theists, is viewed as a maximally great being, a being than which nothing greater can be thought. If something were better than God, then that would be God. So if something were better, if we thought, well, that's better than God, then that whatever is better than God is himself God. That's what God is, the greatest. And so on this conception, God will have every descriptive characteristic, every property that is better to have rather than not have, or it's better to have rather than to lack. And so it's obviously better for God to have this maximal greatness, where there's maximal excellence, or his all of his omnis in every possible world. So it's better for God to have necessary existence, right? That is better for God and his greatness to exist in every possible world. That's better to have truly than not have. And so God's obviously grounded being. He grounds all things, explains all things. And so the way that theists think about God then would be a necessary being. And on S5, this what most philosophers take to be the correct modal logic. This is agreed upon by the vast majority of philosophers. But S5, possibility and necessity, impossibility, they don't vary from world to world. What's impossible in this world, or a world where I never become a pastor, right? That what's possible or impossible, it doesn't vary. It stays fixed. It stays fixed, right? So if something is necessarily true in this world, that 1 + 1 = 2, that's going to be true in another world where I had a burrito for lunch rather than an Olive Garden salad, right? And so those things are fixed. What's possible, impossible, necessary, and so on, right? And so the ontological argument goes, since we conceive of God as a necessary being, as maximally great, if he just exists in one possible world because he is necessary, then guess what? given S5 and it's modal logic. He exists in all worlds. So then it comes down to, is God's existence, the way we are conceiving of God, the way theists have classically conceived of God, is such a being possible? And so you come down to the modal ontological argument, where all you're trying to demonstrate and prove is that simply God is possible. And the atheist, by contrast, would have to say God is impossible. So either God is possible or an impossible. There's no midway there. And if God's possible, he exists. And obviously, if he's impossible, he doesn't exist. And so an atheist cannot say, for instance, that, oh yeah, God, I don't believe in God, but it's possible that God exists. See, an atheist can't make statements like that, given how God is thought of as this maximally great being, and what we would take to be an intuitively plausible view of what we take God to be. And so before I go into the actual written formulation of the ontological argument, which I'm going to give you guys, I'm going to post it in the chat. Actually, I'm going to post in the chat so you guys can look at it. But while I'm posting it, is any questions about what I just said? Because this will be crucial for you understanding the structure of it. I mean, just one little funny thing is it's a maximally great being. If God possibly exists, then God's like the coronavirus. He just invades and spreads to every world. So, his existence is such that he exists in every world. If he exists in one, then he exists in all. And so, because the possibility and necessity, they don't vary from world to world on this standard take of modal logic. So I'll put the argument in here.
How would you answer someone who would say, well, God is so perfect and powerful, why would he actualize such a fallen, broken world instead of actualizing a perfect one that cannot fall?
Yeah, well, you would want to say that God can't actualize worlds where there is constant, unremitting suffering without any solution, or there could never be a morally sufficient reason. So you want to say, like, Thomas Morris gives this example of a world where God actualizes people, and God's causing sweet little baby rabbits to suffer for all eternity, and that's all that's happening in that world, nothing else. Such worlds on this view of God would be impossible then, if God exists. And so that would mean that on theism, gratuitous evil is impossible. As to say, God cannot actualize worlds where there is suffering without morally sufficient reasons. And given this conception of God, then, God is maximally great. He'll have every attribute that's better to have rather than to lack. He'll be incomprehensible on certain levels. So there are thoughts that God has such that we as finite individuals cannot comprehend those thoughts. And so God could have very well morally sufficient reasons in those recesses of his divine mind. So what I would say then is that worlds where there is a evil that exists in which there is not even a possible morally sufficient reason, that such worlds are not possible. And indeed, it's hard to imagine that is possible. I mean, how would we know that it's possible? That was another thing. But to say, I just know that it's intrinsically possible that such worlds exist, that there could be no possible reason for a particular instance of evil when there is a fair amount of good. I think at best we have to say it's unclear if such worlds exist, and we use the arguments that I'm going to give for it being possible that God exists. We then have additional reason to say such worlds don't exist.
Nate, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're Reformed, so I don't know if you agree with Plantinga's, his discussion of so-called Leibniz's lapse, right? Which is, I think J.O. Mackey throws out the objection that there's nothing logically incoherent about free agents always doing good, right? Mm-hmm. So he grants that, but he distinguishes just those possible worlds with what he calls feasible worlds.
Yeah.
Where because he's Reformed, but he's committed to libertarian free will. So he believes that God's actualization of range of worlds that God could actualize is limited by these true counterfactuals of freedom that he just finds himself with, that he has to operate with, right?
Mhm.
He could put together agents like that. And it might be that there's no world that's feasible for God to create where free agents always do it right. Although it might be just broad, just barely, just abstractly, logically possible, but it's not actualizable, right? So do you have a position on that, or?
I do, yeah. So I wrote for Logos some articles on Molinism a while back where I discuss these counterfactuals. And my concern with these counterfactuals is it's actually incompatible with God being the greatest possible being. I do think God would actualize. Well, I would say that there are additional reasons for me to believe why God would not create a world where creatures only do good, and that's because of certain goods like incarnation and atonement and other infinite goods that are displayed for the glory of God. But I have issues with those counterfactuals constraining God, because if God's constrained by these, I can think of a greater being, namely a being that's not constrained by things outside of him. It also seems incompatible with my divine sovereignty, aseity intuitions about things constraining God. That doesn't seem consistent with what I would view to be the greatest possible being. I would say the greatest possible being exemplifies this sort of robust sovereignty that God has. So I would deny that there are this sort of middle knowledge, these counterfactuals of libertarian free will, just because. And also another thing I brought up in these articles is that if these counterfactuals turn out good, then God gets lucky, right? These things turn out nice, like they get a lot of free will and a lot of people coming to salvation freely, then God gets really lucky, doesn't he? And it seems like if God's the greatest possible being, luck is sort of like this accidental sort of feature that happens to you. It seems like something that happens to finite creatures, right? This sort of luck feature. And I can think of a greater being, namely a being which is not subject to luck. So I find this wholly incompatible with this concept of this greatest maximally great being. So for that reason, I don't hold to those counterfactuals. And I think that the consequence argument you can run on Molinism on these views. So I don't think it gets you much good anyway. So I just give them up and just hold to this sort of maximal divine sovereignty intuition that I would view God as. So I don't hold to them. Does that help? Or does that help clarify things? Good. Well, that was a very little technical there. So, but those are some great questions. But I hope you guys understand just so far. If you didn't understand any of that, I hope you understand thus far, at least, that if God's necessity is in one world, it carries over to all, because necessity and possibility doesn't vary from world to world. So I hope that works. And in the chat there, I've posted the actual version of the argument. I think this is Craig's version. I think it's better than Flanagan's because it just provides more clarity and actually helps explain the argument as well as go through the steps. But I'll read it here for us. It is possible, this is one, it is possible that a maximally great being exists. Two, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. So so yeah, if he exists in one possible world, his necessity is going to be in that world. We'll see more of that. Three, if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, just one, then he exists in every possible world, given that he is necessary. If a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. And if it exists in the actual world, if the maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. Therefore, a maximally great being exists. So it's very, so that it's logically valid. It goes through very in painstaking detail the steps there. And 2 through 6 of the argument just follows of logical necessity, just follows. And so it ends up being that the only controversial premise, the one you want to fight, so if 1, 2, and 3, and 4, and 5, and 6 are true, then it follows that God exists. But where do people want to fight? Where's all the action at? And that's going to be in premise 1, step 1. It is possible that a maximally great being exists. If that premise is true, then given S5 and modal logic 2 through 6, it follows pain of irrationality. It follows necessarily and logically that God exists. So basically, it comes down to this idea: is it even possible that God exists? And so if you think just intuitively that it's possible that God exists, then it follows that he exists. That's how we get from there. But any questions on just the argument structure or anything like that before I continue on?
I have one. So you mentioned maximally great being throughout the argument. Is the fact that we're talking about a maximally great being necessary for the argument to be valid, or would that work for any necessary being with a given set of properties?
That would work for any necessary being.
Okay, thank you.
That would work for any necessary being. Yes, that's correct. And yeah, there's discussions about that too. So yeah, you can run it on a lower level and just say necessary being. You could run it on a lower level. But I would say we want to get more than that with what maximal greatness entails, this necessity. And so you're able to get a lot more of these attributes in by this argument. But you could, in theory, present a very, very bare bones, modest version of this. Of course, I'm claiming this is the most important argument. So I'm gonna be not modest. I'm not a modest person. No, I'm just kidding. So we're gonna try to really squeeze all the juice out of this lemon here. Does that help?
I've heard objections to William and Craig saying like, oh, choosing which properties are great making and which ones aren't seem arbitrary. But if it's not necessary for us to use a maximally great being terminology, do you think it would be helpful to just say, well, this is the kind of being I'm talking about, and I think this kind of being is possible?
Well, I don't know if he would say that. I've read his work, and his Talbot. I know his work pretty well. I don't think he would say, if you were to ask him, that they're arbitrary. I don't think he would say that. He would say that there is some debate about great making properties, but I don't think he would say they're arbitrary. He would say it's very clear that it's better for a being to exist that's maximally good as opposed to quasi-maximally good or not as good. It's obviously better that that's better to have maximal goodness, morally goodness, than be like, mid-range, I think Richard Swinburne brings this thing that, it makes more sense for it to be either something to be zero or infinite rather than some arbitrary range in between. So I think that's another problem that people struggle with intuitively in terms of this quasi-maximal greatness or something less than that.
Just to clarify, just want to make sure I'm understanding this. So we don't mean maximally great as being synonymous with necessary, right? Even if maximally great entails necessity, we don't mean the same thing by maximally great and necessary.
Yeah, they can't be synonymous because maximal greatness includes more than necessity.
Sure, gotcha. Okay, just want to make sure.
Yeah, that's a good question.
So I have a quick question. So it seems, would I be correct in assuming that like part of being maximally great is being necessary? Like part of being maximally great?
Yeah, it's an essential aspect of being maximally great is that it be necessary, yeah.
So could you explain why that is?
Well, yeah. So if God were just happened to exist, right? Like God is maximally great. That's what God and maximal greatness, God being a maximally, those are synonymous.
No, what I'm saying is like, why is it required that a maximally great being be necessary? Because it seems like if you don't have that, then the argument fails. So why would you say that like part of being maximally great means you have to be necessary?
Yeah, well, because then God would just happen to exist, like he just happens. It's just a matter of luck, and so if it's just a matter of luck and he doesn't have to exist and is not the necessary ground of being,
he's not
his greatness is not throughout all possibilities. He's not the ground of possibility. It takes away strips God of all of those features, and God just happens to exist, just like you and me happen to exist. And so it also violates the creator-creature distinction. And the creator-creature distinction is important for protecting maximal greatness rather than making God just like us, in every single feature, which we don't want to do, right? We want to make God transcendent and unique ground of being. We don't want to strip him of that. And, having this maximal excellence in every world, that's a part, I would say, of maximal greatness. Him having all these wonderful properties in every world is better than just having him in one. It seems just, I would say, intuitive on that level. Does that help at all?
Yeah, no, that was really good. This probably isn't a very long question, but would you say that this argument also means that God is personal?
Yeah, well, because we tend to give value to persons, right? If I took out an axe, I have a chair right next to me, and I just started chopping down this chair next to me, you might think I have a problem or I'm weird, but you wouldn't have any like major moral objection. Now, if that were my, you know, a child or any person, right? All people have value. So if I were to do that to a person, that would be morally outrageous. So it seems that persons have this value, whereas impersonal things don't. Yeah, so I would say it would be personal. You get all these attributes. And I got another question here. Yeah, in this case, we want to give the great making one because the quasi-maximal greatness is parasitic on maximal greatness and understanding it altogether. So we are going down that route. And if a maximally great being exists and a quasi-maximally great being doesn't exist as a necessity, because if God exists and he would annihilate such being or have at least the ability, in which case it wouldn't be necessary. So there's other things with this, but want to have a maximally great being here. So these are some good questions. And so, you know, obviously, like an atheist doesn't want to be in a position where he's having to say it's impossible that God exists, how he's classically conceived it's impossible. They don't want to say that. They at least want to, you know, say, well, I don't believe that God exists. I think that he doesn't exist, but at least it's possible. And so atheists have come up with some creative, or in one case, Ganelio, a monk, Anselm's contemporary, gave an argument against this, and then contemporary atheists have given arguments against it to try to parody or escape the ontological argument. And they say, you know, what about a maximally great island, right? Or what about a maximally great pizza? And the issue with that is that those are physical things, essentially. Islands essentially physical. And they said those are contingent. So it's not possible that there be a necessary maximally great island or pizza, because if it was a maximally necessary pizza, you couldn't eat it. It's impossible for you to eat it. And of course, for it to be a pizza, you at least have to eat it. And then, you know, I had an atheist friend a while back. He's a good guy. We had many conversations about God and so on. And he said, what about a ghost? Because ghosts are immaterial. So what about a necessary ghost? A maximally great necessary ghost? Well, I would just say that's another word for God, because God's immaterial and he would have all those omnis and everything. And so people end up being in this position where they call it a pizza, but it ends up actually being just like God, and they want to call it a pizza, but it's actually exactly how we describe God. So why not give the proper nomenclature, not misnomer it and call it God? And so I don't think those parodies are successful for those reasons. Going down here a bit. So now I want to argue for it being possible that God exists. It being possible that God exists. What are the reasons one would give to say it's possible? Well, I want to present to you as briefly a cumulative case for the possibility of God existing. As I say, it's not impossible. And I don't think any one of these is a nail in the coffin, but I think combined together, I think we clearly have good intuitive grounds for saying, yeah, it's possible that God exists. So here I go. First reason is at least conceivable, as I brought up earlier, that God exists. And conceivability in coming up, figuring out what's possible or impossible, that what's conceivable is at least a innocent until proven guilty guide of what's possible, right? Just on the face of it, right? Now it could be defeated by other considerations. I grant that, but it's at least conceivable that God exists. There's nothing contradictory. Sorry, I wasn't using hand gestures. There's a fly right here. There's nothing contradictory with the concept of a perfect being. Like yes, God also is ontologically and morally perfect. And just say that there's a perfect being or God exists. There's nothing that just is like obviously incoherent with that statement. Like I'm saying there's a square circle or a married bachelor or the prime minister's a prime number. Nothing inherently contradictory with just saying that, you know, a perfect being possibly exists. It's not crazy or obviously incoherent. So that again provides a guide for the idea that it's possible, yeah, that God exists. 3, many people have had religious experiences of God and his awe and wonder while looking at a sunset, hearing worship music. And so it seems strange that these people are having experiences of something that's impossible. It at least seems that you may not agree with these experiences, but at least we're saying, well, they're having an experience, many of these people, of something that's at least possible, right? Seems strange to experience, to have these mass experiences of contradictory things. Now, of course, you can give counterexamples, but I'm saying taken together here as we go through this provides, I think, pretty solid grounds for God being possible. Number 4, individual, and this is Alexander Prusa's point. I'll be quoting from his article here briefly. But he says, a number of individuals and communities have led flourishing and intellectually sophisticated lives of significant length while holding a motivational center belief that there is a maximally great being. And so he concludes, therefore, it's probable that it is possible that there exists a maximally great being, or it's possible that there's a maximally great being. And so many people have, me personally, my whole life is to glorify God. That is a major motivational center, and as many Christians. And so, and I would say, I hope I live a pretty flourishing life intellectually and morally and so on. And many people are in my position. People at church, people I know live in that, having that as their motivational center. So it seems strange that that would be just a contradiction or impossibility or anything like that. And so I think that gives probable evidence then of that a maximally great being possibly exists. 5, it seems possible, like Bertrand Russell, many atheists would say, well, the universe just exists and that's all. There's no explanation of it. But surely people like Russell wouldn't say it's impossible for there to be an explanation of the universe. As long as it's possible that a necessary being like God explains the universe, explains it, if it's possible, then of course, given that it's possible that a necessary being like God exists in one world, he exists in all. And so you can make all the arguments for theism weaker just by saying it's possible that God exists. And given S5, given that God's a necessary being, he would just automatically exist in all. And so I think that consideration, there's possibly an explanation of the universe from a necessary being. Not that there is an explanation or that we even need an explanation, but just that it's possible, would show that there's one world in which a necessary being explains the world or creation of the world or whatever you want to have. And so because it's a true in one, it follows that God's necessity would transfer over into all worlds. So those are, again, I think if you take them in a combined way, those, I think, reasons together furnish powerful evidence that, that it's possible that God exists. If it's possible that God exists, and it follows, given S5, that God exists. So those are those arguments. I think I want to move ahead briefly here and talk about just a few things to summarize, because I know I'm running tight on time here. Well, actually, I do want to take questions about that. So any questions on just me arguing that's possible?
I'm sorry. What would you say for somebody that says they want to kind of reduce the evidential force of the possibility intuition to being merely epistemic, right? Mm-hmm. So a classical example to give illustration is, like I'm sure like the Goldbach's conjecture, which is, I think, so thus far still an unsolved conjecture in mathematics that every even number greater than 2, every prime number greater than 2 is the sum of, every even number greater than 2 is the sum of 2 primes. I think that's the way to say it. And there's computers turning out thousands of digits. So far, it's worked out so far. But we have less than mathematically inductive proof, right? So it's still a conjecture. Mm-hmm. All you need is like one case way out there beyond what we've checked, right? So either it's necessarily false or necessarily true, but either way, it seems like, so it's kind of merely epistemic. And so the kind of thought experiment is you try to detach the metaphysical reality from the mere epistemic seeming. So maybe the atheist or non-theist could say, well, if you talk about the attributes of God, especially if I kind of like throw in like Christian theism with Trinity in there, has there been a definitive proof of consistency? It's just, rather than just kind of rebutting accusations of inconsistency, right? And so kind of like say, well, maybe all this is, nature of God is very mysterious, throwing like classical attributes like simplicity and all that stuff, which, there's like debates within Christian circles too. And, try to make it tone down that evidential force to like where it becomes just merely epistemic. How would you have any?
Yeah. So, we have to use epistemology to determine metaphysics, right? So that's what I'm doing. And so I'm giving positive reasons. Now, So if someone gives positive reasons against it, saying, well, there are some epistemic things that don't line up with reality, well, that's obviously true. But I'm giving good reasons right now to think that this is possible, given what we know. That's the first thing I would say. Now, as for incoherences, well, then we would just, if something is incoherent in the nature and character of God, then we would just scrap it and say, well, this is the greatest possible being, so it has to be possible. So whatever that is, whatever conception that is, then we're fine with that. Now, Trinity incarnation, I personally think Thomas B. Morris does a great job with the two minds theory for the incarnation. I think Michael Ray does a good job with the Trinity, so I don't think there's any problem there. So I personally am not moved by that, because we do have good reasons for God's existence being possible, just like we would for any normal modal claim. And I don't think it's as foggy as Gumbach's conjecture, is what I would say. So we actually have independent positive reasons for thinking it's possible. That's a good question, though. That's very good.
I was thinking of a line of reply, like it kind of gets quasi presuppositional, you know, in that the objection to make it stick, you got to take these abstract modal intuitions as being aimed towards truth and truth conducive, right? So what worldview, if you want to talk about it, naturalism or without God, just atheism, naturalism, or Christian theism, that the very intuition of not just regular things, but very abstract, recondite issues like, you know, maximally great being, right? These modal intuitions, which worldview better explains how these intuitions could be truth conducive. And if you go with naturalism, we just evolved, these intuitions just helped us to evolve, like finding food and escaping predators, you know, sort of. And now we're gonna use that, develop out of that evolutionary history to try to solve these metaphysical problems. Well, good luck, right?
Yeah.
How would you trust any intuitions regarding theism or any kind of, you know, very recondite issue? But on theism, you have a better ground for trusting that they at least are the type of thing that could aim towards truth, right? So
I love that. Yeah, and that, you know, that slaughters the kind of gratuitous evil thing that's possibly great. There's possible gratuitous evil, right? If you're just if you just evolved and you're an animal that's based on survival, I mean, I think as Alexander Proust and Tom Crisp point out, like, why would you trust your modal intuitions about gratuitous evil, or there being possibly no explanation about no morally sufficient reason for evil that exists? I mean, if I'm here just to reproduce and find food, it doesn't seem like complex modal intuitions like that would be warranted on such a naturalistic account. So I think that defeats those arguments that I hadn't considered in preparing for this. So thank you for that. That's helpful. So yeah, very good. And Matthew Graham, I noticed you commented on here. You said, I think the worry from within Christendom is this argument don't center on premise one, seems to do more with the ontology of perfect being, possible worlds, etc. Right. So if you just didn't believe in S5, then the argument wouldn't work. If you didn't think there's a perfect being didn't think it was possible, then obviously that would center on premise one. So yeah, if you deny the whole framework of S5 and other things that most analytic philosophers deny, then yeah, you probably wouldn't think this argument's very good. I would just respond and appeal to the intuitiveness of S5. If anybody is unclear what that is, you can always Wikipedia that. There's a reason why most philosophers hold to it. It does seem like possibility necessity doesn't really change from world to world. If something's necessary, it does seem like that it would be necessary in every world. So that's why the majority of philosophers endorse S5, as do I.
Hey, Nate, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Oh, Matt, was Matt gonna say something? I didn't mean to cut him off.
I can wait.
Go ahead, Matt. I'll go after you.
Yeah, I think the worry would be with premise 4. If a maximally great being exists in every, because right, if just given possible world semantics, 1, 2, and 3 are just almost definitionally the case, right?
That would be you're just denying S5 is what that would be. Yeah.
No, I'm worried about 4.
No. S5 is a modal, is axioms of modal logic. So if you deny that, then you're just denying S5, it seems to me.
Okay.
No.
I'm telling you what my worry is. My worry is 4, not 5. So
No. S5 is okay. I'm sorry. So okay. We're talking about different things. You're talking about the premises and the argument. I'm talking about the modal ontological system from which these follow.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Premise 4. I understand what you're saying now. So, if maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on the underlying ontology of that's presupposed to make that premise.
When you say underlying ontology, how are you using that word?
So when we talk about modal claims, right, this is why I asked about whether it's an account or just like in a conceptual framework. Because if it's an account of what makes modal claims true or false, then we're talking now about truth makers and that sort of thing. If it's a conceptual framework, then it could be something that could be disposed of potentially if it's not as valuable of conceptual. If you think of a better conceptual framework for thinking about these kinds of modal problems or claims.
Yeah, so you could reject truth maker theory and hold to the argument. It is not related to truth maker theory. So you can have various accounts of it, and the argument would still work. It just needs you need to hold to S5 for this to follow. That's all. But it wouldn't require any theory of truth makers. There are a variety of people who deny truth maker theory that would hold to the argument being valid and sound.
Oh, sure. No, I don't know of anybody who would deny its validity, right? The question of
so you're not denying its validity. Okay.
No, I'm not worried about the validity, right?
Okay.
It's just a formal. That's just a formal procedural issue, right? Like, so when we're talking about the truth of each proposition within the argument, it seems like there's maybe some worry there.
Well, so you're concerned about 4. So if it says, just to go over it, just so I can explain it, maybe that'll help.
Yeah.
Because it's not clear on what the issue is. So if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, so if God exists in every possible way things could have turned out, this is one of the ways it turned out, and so God would just exist.
In virtue of being a necessary being.
Yes, because that's what it would mean to exist in every possible world, is to be necessary.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks.
You bet. Devin, did you want to say something?
I was just going to ask you a question. So we actually had Christian teach on this in our Ratio Christi group. So one of the questions we had was, we're big Thomas Aquinas fans. At least me and several others are in this group.
Well, I think there's a lot to like there. Thomas is obviously one of the most brilliant minds. Yeah.
Right. So, but I guess St. Thomas did not particularly like this argument or thought there were some issues with it. Will it take you down a rabbit hole to kind of dive into why that is, or what some of the issues that Thomists may have with this argument?
Well, I would take it to be a skepticism about a priori knowledge, really, intuition.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and probably I'm not an expert in this area, so I'm speaking from just limited study in church history in graduate school. But my take is, and I did read Thomas, but my take is that he held to an empiricist epistemology, not consistently, I would say. And so, and also views of analogy and trying to infer from God's essence that he exists, just conceptually, I don't think sits well within how he understands analogy and creator-creature distinction plus empiricism. Well, I think that would be kind of Thomistic worries, yeah.
Can I ask you this as well? Because I know, like, one big way with Thomas knowing about God is through way of negation, right?
Via negativity, I can't speak properly, and but also the way of analogy, right? I mean, he didn't purely say it was you could get positive attribution through analogy.
So, with this idea or concept of a maximally great being, is that like language that Thomists would use? Matt, I don't know. I know you're a big Aquinas guy. I don't know if you would have anything to add, but would that be, do they use language, like, would they have a problem with things like the language of maximally great being? Sean, you may know.
Yeah, some would.
Okay.
Thomists try to derive their attribute. I mean, the ontological argument that Nate's giving relies on what's called perfect being intuition, perfect being theology. So central intuition is God is the greatest conceivable being. So you kind of try to unpack that idea, right? So if God is power, then God's going to have it to a maximum degree and so on. I think, I'm not too versed on Thomism, but I think their central intuition is that God is a pure act, isn't it?
Right.
They try to derive some of that. Maybe there's like those two concepts could, intersect somehow. God being pure act, there's no potential for him not to exist. So you kind of get necessity out of the unpacking pure actuality, and
right.
Some other, great making properties could be snuck in that way. I don't know, unpack that way.
Yeah. I think that's right. I think one could argue that it's better to be pure act rather than not. I mean, that would be a route if one thought the idea were logically coherent. Yeah.
Yeah. If I could add just a couple of thoughts here, there are certainly in Thomistic circles, there are worries about even the adoption of perfect being theology and talking about God in terms of maximally great properties and that kind of thing. In that at least some construals of this Anselmian perfect being theology, even if they don't necessitate this conclusion, they can sometimes sound like God just has the most power and the most knowledge, as if he's a member of a class. And the Thomists just flatly deny that, right? They're going to say God is not a member of a class. He's not just the greatest thinker. He's not just the greatest and most powerful being. He's not just the most present being to things. They would say that is to make God into what some would call just a really powerful angel, right? Just having these like differences of degree. So Thomas is going to say, no, God isn't just another being that's a member of a class. God's essence is unknowable for the Thomist.
Yeah, and to me, an angel can't be necessary, so there's no way. I think that you have the necessary and contingent distinction. That, I think, provides ample ground for the creator-creature distinction, to where you don't make God just another thing. His thoughts are not contingent, they're necessary. They don't happen to exist. There's a whole other chain of being there in distinction. So God's just not one other existing thing, right? He ends up being necessary, and everything else other than God, in my view, is contingent. So I don't think the angel argument really goes through because, of course, angels are radically contingent. So,
yeah. Well, just a quick follow-up. The claim isn't that from the Thomistic perspective, again, I'm not, there's a whole another discussion as to whether or not it's true or not, but just understanding what the Thomist is saying is that conceptually that the perfect being theology framework, at least as it's talked about in contemporary analytic circles, seems to presuppose a sort of univocal God talk, right? And when it employs its talk about attributing properties and attributes to God, it seems to speak of them univocally. And the reason Aquinas employs analogical God talk is because we can't talk about God univocally because we don't even know God's essence. So God is, I'm just saying this because I think this is one of the criticisms that a Thomist would make of perfect being theology. And this perfect being theology seems to undergird the ways we talk about God in the ontological argument. And I think that's part of the worry, is this maximally great being talk. What does it mean for you to have a maximally great property? How do we understand, apart from some ontological analysis, rather than just some logical assertion, right? Like, how do we know that certain properties or attributes of God are great making properties? Like we can assert that, but how do we know that without some kind of analysis of being?
Yeah, I think those were some of the things I mentioned, the analogy thing. I might be concerned about that. It's not clear to me, though, that any of those criticisms go through. You could say it's an analogy. We're using intuition to derive that, and it is intuition of what is analogous we know. So it's not really clear to me that goes through. If someone were sympathetic towards that, I think they could utilize it, provided that they're not hamstringed by an empiricist epistemology. Does seem to me. So I mean, I have people that go different ways on that, though. So hard to tell. Yeah. But yeah, moving forward, just a couple of thoughts. So just, I think even if you didn't accept the arguments from God being possible, you could use other theistic arguments that prove that God necessarily exists. Transcendental arguments from logic, math, and morality that are used by presuppositionalists and by Frank Turek, who's not a presuppositionalist, but his books sound like he is. So, you know, you could use transcendental arguments from logic, math, and morality, all which prove a necessary being. And then, of course, you have arguments, the Leibnizian cosmological argument, which I kind of alluded to. But basically, you can make that a much softer argument and just say it's possible that there's an explanation of the universe, and then you get a necessarily existing God, and then justifying the possibility premise. So using other theistic arguments, divine conceptualist arguments, one could use, as Quinton Smith and William Lane Craig have done, to justify the possibility premise. You could, or at least Craig does that, but Quinton Smith just gives a divine conceptualist argument for a necessary existing God from divine concepts and so on, kind of playing the role of Plato's forms, if you will. So, you know, you give these kind of arguments, which I personally buy into, and so you get this necessarily existing being. My personal view is that you don't need resurrection arguments for the existence of the Christian God. You can get to the Christian God using reason alone. So I'm very optimistic about that. I developed a paper, an argument in graduate school using Richard of St. Victor and Richard Swinburne for an argument for the Trinity based on perfect being theology, God being this maximally great being. And I have the argument here. I'll post it if you want to look into the nuts and bolts. I'll give a informal summarization of it here, but I'll put the put that here. So that's the summarization of the argument. But basically, the idea is that God's the greatest conceivable being, greatest possible being, maximally great being, and that he'll have every attribute that's better to have rather than the lack, right? I think the sun's coming in here. And so the idea is that it's better to have this self-giving love intrinsic to God, this sort of self-giving, self-loving, self-giving love, which is nature of what the highest degree of love is sort of self-giving love. And that implies at least two persons, because in order to have the self-giving love, there has to be two persons, right? And then in order to have self-giving cooperative love, which is two people loving each other and then giving then having self-giving love cooperatively for another, you get three persons. So you have this attribute of self-giving cooperative love, which is better to have rather than not have. And if you have that, then you get three persons, which is what we believe in Doctrine of the Trinity. Someone says, well, why can't I have an infinite amount of people, or 7 or 8 people, or 9 or 10 or 11, 12, 13, 14 people, right? Well, all you need to minimally satisfy self-giving cooperative love, which is three persons, you have two persons giving self-giving love to each other and then working together for the love of the other. You just need to minimally satisfy that with three persons. And given Occam's razor and simplicity considerations, you would get down to three persons, which is exactly what we think as Christians. So I would say that you can get to the triune God through reason alone. And so I think you can get to all sorts of things, all sorts of interesting conclusions. I think you can argue for this sort of maximal sovereignty, which I hold to. I have a divine aseity argument against libertarian free will. It's in the literature I reference, but basically, yeah, given God's aseity, it's incompatible with libertarian free will. So I have some form of compatibilism going on there. And I've used perfect being theology to present the gospel to people. God is the greatest possible being, so he's maximally just and maximally gracious. Well, if God's maximally just and he should punish you for your sins, how is God going to save you? Well, he sent Jesus in his place to take that. So you can get all sorts of things. Is Jesus an incomplete savior or complete savior, as the Heidelberg Catechism teaches? Well, it's better that he be a complete savior. If he were an incomplete savior, I can think of a greater being, namely a being who has himself as a complete savior. So I think you can get all sorts of wonderful conclusions from this, that you can generate a doctrine of hell. I think that what we conceive of God to be his greatest possible being, I think is only compatible with the Christian worldview. And so that's why I say this is, I think, one of the most important arguments for the existence of God. I said a lot, so if anybody has any questions by way of follow-up, it would be great.
Yeah, so in Mere Christianity, one thing that C.S. Lewis mentions is, in addition to having these reasons for believing there are three persons, he said if you try to posit a fourth person, he can see how it would be distinct from the first three. Do you think that's true?
Say that last part again. It kind of came through muffled in the recording.
So his response for why aren't there four persons is, well, let's say there is. How would it be different from the other three? He said, well, I don't think it could be.
I'd have to think about that more, but that's similar to the Eastern-Western arguments with Eastern Orthodox, that they believe that the Father precedes, or that the Father, the Son and the Spirit both proceed from the Father, the filioque clause, that whole thing. And so on that Eastern view, you can't distinguish. There's no way to distinguish the persons. So I guess one could use an argument like that. I haven't thought carefully about that, though. Just arguments against the Eastern Orthodox filioque clause there, that clause they reject, which the West holds to. But yeah, that's interesting. I can't say, oh no, that argument's terrible and false, because I don't know. Yeah, I haven't done much thinking, but that's interesting consideration. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
So I have a question. I feel bad because this has been very college level, and I'm about to bring it down to second grade. But okay, so there's this concept of maximally great, and this might have been addressed before, but I didn't understand the words being used. So let's go over this for the rest of us in the room here. So maximally great, what attributes are allowed to be called, like what attributes have the liberty to be called great? For example, and I mean this with no disrespect to God, obviously, but just for the sake of understanding this argument, if this greatest possible being had the attribute of being murderous, would he be the greatest possible murderer?
Yeah. Well, so a great-making attribute is whatever's better to have rather than the lack. And of course, being morally bankrupt, which would be involved in murdering somebody, would not be better to have rather than the lack, right? Let's hope so. So anything that's better to have. So we ask the question, okay, will God know all true propositions? Well, what's better, for him to be ignorant or for him to be all-knowing? Well, it seems like it's better for him to know all things. Knowledge is a good thing, especially for a being who's morally perfect. And if he was murderous, he wouldn't be morally perfect. And so the moral perfection would rule out God being murderous, because it's better to be morally perfect than not. Does that make sense, Tyler?
Yeah, it did. So I guess a follow-up to that question is, from this kind of logical argumentative standpoint, where do we derive what is and isn't morally good?
Well, Romans chapter 2 says the law is written on our hearts. And so we do have capabilities to know what is good, right, and beautiful, intrinsic to our human nature, I would say. And given that God's made us with cognitive faculties that produce mostly true beliefs, I would say that we do have an idea of what is right and wrong. Now, obviously, people at times suppress that truth and unrighteousness, given what Romans 1 has to say. But I would say that human beings do know what's right and good and true and beautiful. Otherwise, we wouldn't know the Bible. It's obvious as it stands, right? So I would say God made us in his image, and the ability to know what those things are and to know him. And so we're able then to know what is good and what is terrible. what is beautiful? Is the Holocaust beautiful, or is the sunset beautiful? Is loving a large group of people and helping and caring for them beautiful, or is the murder of 6 million Jews beautiful? Well, that's obviously not beautiful. That's horrific, right? So intrinsically in itself horrific. So I would say that we do know those things. We do know it's better. I think if we reflect honestly on our intuitions, it is better to be all-knowing rather than ignorant. It is better to be morally good. Now you say, what extent is it to be morally good? Lying, cheating, stealing, those are all things that are bad. So God wouldn't possess those properties. So does that make sense, Tyler?
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm just thinking it through a little bit, and if I come back to another question, I'll pop in.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
So when we're talking about maximal greatness, are we talking about something like modal greatness, where we're putting a value on these attributes, or are we talking about something like higher degrees of being, like the?
Yeah, that's a great question. We're talking about, I think, with a higher focus on ontological. What is something that is great? What characteristics it possesses, and that includes moral greatness. But it's not limited to that. It includes other things, as you can tell by the way I'm talking, right? So maximal greatness definitely entails moral greatness, but it's not synonymous with it, to where it means the exact same thing. Definitely is included in it, but it's not the only thing we're talking. So yeah, we're talking about what makes a being great.
So if we were to use wisdom as an example, are we saying wisdom is great because wisdom is important and it has value for a being, or are we saying that it's great because it's adding something to that being, rather than like saying being unwise would be to lack something?
Well, I would say we're saying wisdom is great because it is it's seen by everybody as a virtue, and God would have that virtue on a level that no human being possesses it, the highest possible degree out of anything we could ever categorize. Yeah. So I would say that we're just able to recognize wisdom and say that is a virtue. So whatever God has that's like that virtue or similar to that virtue, God possesses to a maximal degree.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Could you elaborate on what you mean by that? I think this is the problem that I'm trying to understand, because I mean, shoot, if the ontological argument works, awesome, I love that. But my worry, I'm just not sure how it. Maybe I just don't understand it. But I think I need to understand, what do we mean when we say like wisdom is maximally great in a perfect being? Like, what does that even mean?
Well, it depends on what you take wisdom to be.
Well, or just any good attribute, any perfect, any great making property, let's say. What do we mean when? And you can select whichever one you think is the best representative example. But like, if we pick out a great making property, and then say that God has that property maximally, I think on the face of it, it's like he's got the most, right? Like if the great making property is wisdom or love, he's got the most of it. But correct my understanding if I'm not thinking about that right, or if I'm not thinking about the way you're thinking about it. I'm not sure I understand what we mean by that.
Well, it wouldn't want to just up the dial and say it's higher than us, but we want to say it's on a different level than us, right? Because of course, God would possess this necessarily, which we would not possess any of these necessarily. So we want to say that it's not just a ratcheted up, right, level, higher than us, but we want to say it's on a completely different field of categorization because God is necessary.
So what would be an example of a great making property?
Oh yeah, like being necessarily good.
Oh,
right?
So goodness.
Or but when I even say good though, right, I don't mean that God fulfills certain world demands and he's keeping the law like a good little boy or girl. I mean to say that God is a paradigm and foundation of goodness itself.
Okay, but but goodness would be an example, like say moral goodness. No, well, I'm sorry, not moral goodness, because you were saying that.
But when I say moral goodness, I don't mean to say, like when I say Matt's a morally good person, I am communicating, right, that you're fulfilling certain demands of God's law. There's repentance and humility in your life. When I yeah, buddy, when I ascribe that to God, though, right? I'd mean to say God is the foundation of all morality. He is a paradigm of goodness. So I don't mean to say when he's morally good like me.
Okay, but let's say we take exemplars of human exemplars of goodness, right? Like we could consider them to be maybe the best example that we know of goodness. Maybe some ancient Spartan warrior as an example of a particular virtue, right? The highest we've seen. We don't mean that, right? We mean
no.
Now, what's different between saying that God is just the highest example of something versus what you're saying, maximally great making property is? Like I'm sorry, maybe let me rephrase that. So what's the difference between that and saying that God has all great making properties maximally? What's the difference between those two?
Repeat the two again.
Sorry. So like we can think of, if we think of maximally, right, we could think of a human exemplar of maximally exemplifying a particular virtue. Say a Spartan warrior maximally exemplifies courage.
And God doing it. Is that what you're saying? What's the difference between those two?
Well, but then when we say God maximally exemplify, or he holds these great making properties maximally, we mean something different than just a human exemplar.
Right? Yeah, right.
Well, can you maybe elaborate on what the difference there would be?
I fear that I might be a little repetitive here, so excuse me, I'm not trying to beat a dead horse here, but I would say that the difference is, of course, is that exemplar in the case of a Spartan or whatever, that one, it's contingent, and two, it's not actually an exemplar in the sense that I need to follow that. It would be good if I followed him perfectly, because of course he does have moral flaws, right? In the case of God, there's a sense in which that paradigm is actually in fact perfect, but not that just as perfect, but that is necessarily perfect. And it is in fact objectively the objective paradigm. And it provides that paradigm through commandments which human beings are to strive for, right? So it's the necessity of the paradigm, and it's the actual fact that is the paradigm. Whereas you can say that we're to follow that Spartan, but you don't mean that perfectly, because there are moral blemishes on that Spartan.
Also, to be a maximally great making property, great making property has to have an intrinsic maximum, right? So, in a case of the Spartan, that's why one of these supposed counterexamples, like the perfect island or the maximally great island and pizzas, doesn't work, because like there's no intrinsically great making property of an island. Like palm trees, you could have more palm trees. You could have, bigger slices of pizza. So
more dancing girls, right?
Yeah, dancing girls. So regarding the Spartan, he could exemplify at a human level, some virtue, but there's no intrinsic maximum there, because let's say he exemplified it for 30 years. Well, you could conceive of somebody just like that Spartan exemplifying for 31 years and 30. So there's no intrinsic maximum when it comes to these human examples, right? So in the case of God, it's not like God just exemplifies it for a limited time, stops, right? He does it always and in every possible world. So just have this great making properties, which you could find exemplars of in human race, human beings. But then only in the case of God, because of the modal status of his being, right? That you could ratchet it up to infinity, in basically. As you said, like earlier, Swinburne says, it's a good plausible principle that it's arbitrary to sort of, just kind of stay. God has it just this much and no more. It's either nothing or infinity. And in the case of God, that's the intuition that's driving that perfect being theology. You have exemplars of great making properties, but you ascribe them to the true maximal limit, and the only person that you could do that to is God, because of his modal status, unique modal status.
Sure, and it sounds like this is a mode of predication, right? So we are predicating of these particular attributes, both necessity and infinity. Is that right? Nate's emphasizing the necessity, and Sean, you're emphasizing the infinity of that attribute. Do we mean the same thing when we say God is good and Nate is good? Do those words mean the same thing?
No.
Do they mean completely different things?
Oh, they're analogous.
They're analogous. All right, well, cool. So in your readings of perfect being theology, there is a mode of predication that talks about about an analogous God talk, and elaborates on what would that look like?
Well, we ascribe goodness. We mean something different with God. There are, I would say, I do hold the univocal modes of properties that I have and God has. I'm concrete. God's concrete. So that's kind of hard to escape that for univocity. But I would say that a lot of the attributes of God, we speak of in an analogous way. When I say I'm good and God's good, I'm using that in a similar, though not identical way. And yeah, that is, there are people that hold to the analogous predication, if you will, that would hold to the validity and soundness of the ontological argument. So that's why I've kind of sidestepped that discussion, but.
Yeah, and I mean, certainly if you're addressing an atheist or agnostic who doesn't, or who might try to argue that God is impossible, then the first premise is key. But I think addressing a Thomist or another person within Christendom who doesn't like the ontological argument, it's this perfect being theology that's the crux of the difference as to whether or not we like or dislike the ontological argument, it seems. Would you agree with that, or?
No, I don't know if I do. I mean, I've heard some Thomists in the past express worries about the ontological argument in graduate school, but I've had Thomists that would accept the argument. So I don't think it's germane to Thomism to reject the argument, especially if one's in the more analytic tradition and knows S5 and is interested in that kind of stuff. I don't think that is germane to the Thomist tradition to reject that. So, or essential to Thomism. Then there's debates of what's essential to a position. I guess I'd be a presuppositionalist. So some people would say I'm not because of views I hold about the impossibility of the contrary. So am I really Van Tillian? Am I really, well, people say, well, this is what it means to be that. And so you get into those discussions, and I think that'll take us too far afield, frankly.
Well, here's the two criticisms that are substantial as far as I see it. And the Thomists that I know would probably agree with this, is that, again, it's this maximally great being and possible world semantics. We don't talk like that. We don't think that's a good way to account for modality or even necessarily talk about modality in that way. But the second one is this mode of argumentation, this a priori sort of argument. As you mentioned, Thomists are empiricists, but not in the sort of Hume and Lockean sense, right? They don't have that epistemology, they don't have that ontology. So they're empiricists, but one would certainly characterize them falsely if you thought they were empiricists in the same way that, say, Locke and Hume and those guys were.
How are they different, would you say?
There's typically it's some form of moderate realism, right? Like that it's not, so for example, in Locke, right, or Hume, where they almost see the senses as a camera taking a snapshots, and then the cognitive process is basically putting these events together and forming concepts and things like that.
But what I'm asking, though, not about the realism or anything. I'm curious, do they hold to the same theory of knowledge, that all knowledge is ascertained to the five senses.
It begins in the senses. Yes.
So all knowledge is ascertained through the five senses, right?
It begins. No, not all knowledge is arrived at by way of the senses. It all begins by way of the senses, right? So Thomas and Aristotle, they believe that once you form concepts and judgments, you put together deductions, right? So you can arrive at metaphysical knowledge, for example, and you don't arrive at that by looking at anything, right?
Mm-hmm.
You don't just look at the world and then come to the conclusion that nothing cannot come from nothing.
Yeah, and I guess my thinking is, why would someone embrace that view that all knowledge begins through the five senses? Is that an argument from the five senses? How does that work out?
No, it's a reflection on the way that we know. So the way that the medievals, the ancients and the medievals did philosophy was pretty different from the way that post-Cartesian philosophy's done. I mean, they started with, all right, look, we have knowledge. Now it's how do we have some kind of account of it? So really epistemology for the pre-Cartesians was more of an ontology of knowledge. It wasn't this sort of, let's talk about justified true belief and criterion for knowledge. Like, how do we justify claims and how do we know that we have knowledge and things like that? It was more like, look, yeah, I know it can have knowledge. And only a moron would think we can't have knowledge. The question is not, can we have knowledge, but what is it and how do we know? So they develop an ontology of knowledge.
Yeah, I guess just my thinking on that is it would seem hard to justify things like the problem of induction, for instance. I think with that view, there's no amount of deducing you can do from the five senses that would lead you to that. The issue of other minds, I think the matrix problems, issues of skepticism would seem to always accompany empirical theories of knowledge, which is why I'm not an empiricist in my thinking. So, but anyways, those are that again. This is kind of far afield, and I think we can probably have this elsewhere. But yeah, that's. I tend to think that rational theories solve the problem of induction, problem of causality from not arguing from argument from composition. So I know that I know things don't pop into existence on cause of nothing. I can't say I've just seen so many instances like that, right? It's just I intuitively know that being cannot come from non-being. It's not that I've done an inductive survey, because that would be a problem with like the fallacy of composition. So I tend to avoid it because you run into you tend to deny obvious articles of knowledge, which we have if one holds to an empiricist or anything like an empiricist epistemology. So, I mean, I would understand why someone would be uncomfortable with various modal claims if someone holds to an empiricist epistemology. But I'm like, well, anything like an empiricist epistemology is fraught with all sorts of skeptical problems. And so in my thinking, it would seem so much the worse for that type of epistemology. So anyway, it's quite far from the ontological argument, I think. At this point.
Maybe it's just related to the point that was made, but I was looking at old article by Dr. Norman Geisler, who's a Thomist, evangelical Thomist, and he also didn't like the ontological argument, being a good Thomist. And if I could summarize like his main reason, his objection is that there is a assumption in the ontological argument, and I think he was talking about the classical Anselmian one. I think it would also apply to the modal version, is that there's a hidden premise which is that rationally inescapable is the real, right? And he objects to that. So I guess that's just basically objecting to more of a rationalist approach to epistemology. So yeah, you have this nice logical S5, possible world semantic, all nicely done, but it's just a doubt about what that could accomplish. You're just trying to spin out these, it's an existence proof that just comes a priori. That's just very puzzling. I mean, that's amazing, right? So
yeah, if one were an empiricist, you're not going to be.
There's an
be too warm towards it. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. Me and Matt were actually trained under Dr. Geisler, so no surprise there, right?
Right.
Well, That's good. Maybe, hey, maybe we can end up having a discussion down the road, Nate, with you and either Matt or maybe another one of the Southern Evangelical Seminary professors on this topic. I think it'd probably be useful and helpful to flush some of those ideas out. So good stuff.
I love that.
Yeah. Did anybody else have any other questions regarding this? I think it's been I like this. I think it's been one of the best shows we've done. I think it's good to be able to go deep sometimes, and people that you brainiacs on here that crave getting into the deeper waters sometimes. These kind of talks, I think, help to do that. So I don't know if anybody else had any other questions for Nate, but speak now or forever hold your peace. We're going to let him get back to his family.
I have another question. I was wondering if an argument like this can work for any necessary being, then what do you do with a parody that says, well, let's suppose there's a necessary being that has, I don't know, lots of great making properties, but maybe not love. Now, I don't see why that would be. Would you have to say that's a contradiction with a necessary being that does not love in order to shut down that parody?
Say that last part again. It's just the audio is coming in a little.
How would you shut down that parody?
The parody of what? That's from.
Like, suppose we use an ontological argument for some necessary being that has, I don't know, maybe lots of properties that God has, but just not love or not whatever other property.
Yes, this is the objection of quasi-maximal greatness, right? That what about if you say that there's a necessary being that's quasi-maximal greatness, right? And such a being would be incompatible with the greatest possible being, because if God's the greatest possible being, then he has the ability to annihilate or create anything, right? Anything. And so quasi-maximal greatness is incompatible with maximal greatness. They both can't exist simultaneously. So either one exists or the other does not. So why should you prefer it? Well, because quasi-maximal greatness is parasitic on maximal greatness. That's one reason. Second reason is that, at Swinburne's point, is either something zero or infinity. To say it's somewhere in between is kind of arbitrary. It's just kind of whimsical. There's no principled reason for it. And so for those two reasons, it seems rational to prefer maximal greatness. It also seems, lastly, I'll put this last point, maximal greatness seems to be the best foundation for maximal goodness, right? Which is what we ground the moral argument for. So I think all of those considerations, I think, help get to this sort of maximal greatness. It seems less arbitrary. Quasi-maximal greatness is parasitic on maximal greatness. And it seems like the best foundation for a being worthy of worship and moral goodness is our paradigm.
So what is parasitic on maximal greatness?
Well, because it's quasi. It's not to that level yet. So that's what I mean by that.
Okay. So I'm aware it's not on that level, but what does it have to do with that being not
parasitic, meaning that you understand what it means in light of something else. In light of what is maximal, it's falling short from something else. It's not at that maximal level yet because it's fallen short from maximal greatness.
So if we were to insert this quasi-maximally great being into the ontological argument, would you deny premise one that it's possible for that reason?
Good question. Good. Yes, I would. Good question. Yeah, I would deny that in light of other things that we know about how we define God and all those arguments for thinking God is possible as opposed to it being way less than that. Being worthy of worship, that's how theists view God, whereas quasi-maximal greatness, oh, look at the beautiful sunsets. Maybe a being less than great created this. Usually not the most emotive, immediate thought people have.
So do you think we need to say the maximally great being is possible in order to shut down the quasi-maximally great being?
Yes. Yeah, very perceptive. Absolutely, Christian. Yes.
Okay.
So that would shut down that. If you grant the possibility of a maximally great being, that would then rule out quasi-maximal greatness.
So if only one necessary being can exist, then what's the problem with, sorry, how do we know that it's possible if there's no contradiction with this contradictory, no, if there's no contradiction with this other quasi-maximally great being existing?
Well, you know, you actually answered your own question, and I like your train of thought. So if God is a maximally great being, he has all of these properties of the highest degree, whereas quasi-maximal greatness, by definition, doesn't have that, right?
Right.
So if you have maximal greatness, it rules out quasi-maximal greatness because he alone is the only being that's necessary. He alone is the only being that has this degree of greatness and cannot share that with any other being. He alone is the only incorruptible being that can create and destroy or annihilate. Whereas quasi-maximal greatness is incompatible with that. And so when you have this maximal great being, you can infer these attributes and then infer that such a being does not exist, a quasi-maximally great being.
Also regarding the quasi-maximal objection, just take one more attribute away from that quasi-maximal great being, and then you got a quasi-maximal great being. That's incompatible with that quasi-maximal great being. So you just kind of keep stripping away, kind of have a Sorites type argument where all these competitors to the really maximal great being kind of fall out. They're incompatible, right?
So that's kind of my issue, though, is if we have all these compatible or incompatible necessary beings that don't seem to have any contradictions in their properties, which is like the main thing that we're checking for with the maximally great being. How do we know which one it is?
That's why the overall intuitions about the greatness of the overall package of attributes. So you got the maximal great being, which has, you know, necessary existence, omniscience, the 3 O's, and, you know, benevolence, omnibenevolence. Take that, and that being that has all those, you know, set of attributes is the greatest than any of those sort of quasi, you know, counterfeits, I guess, right? So it's the intuition about the relative greatness of the entire package of attributes, I think. What do you think?
Yeah, and I want to add on to what Sean's saying here. Also, the points 3 and 4. So remember that part of it was logical consistency, conceivability, but I also gave 2 additional ones to that. I said that that's what people experience, right? So that lends credence to that. And then also I said that that's a motivational center for a flourishing life is the greatest, the highest, right? And that's what many Christians hold to, is that they pursue for the glory of God. That's a center of their motivational core, right? And then people don't have that with quasi-maximal greatness, it would seem. So those 2 points, I think, provide reasons for thinking a maximally great being is possible, whereas a less than maximal great being is not. Then you have the arbitrary objection that I gave and the parasitic objection that I gave. So I think all those together, I think, provides good intuitive grounds for ruling out such beings.
Okay. So one last thing then. Now, suppose someone thinks it's possible for there to be a 4-personal God. Would you have to show that 4 personal beings can't exist to shut down an ontological argument like that?
Well, that comes an additional on reflecting on maximal greatness, right? We would know I would say I would know those through greater reflection on principles such as metaphysical principles such as simplicity, and reflecting on the property of cooperative self-giving love. So reflection on those 2 principles would then rule it down to a tripersonal maximally great being.
Right. Well, you mentioned when you said, all right, well, we don't see reason to say there are more than 3 persons, but it seems kind of troubling to me to take, oh, I don't see why there should be more than 3, to then say, I don't see why it should be possible for this maximally great being that has more than 3 persons in it to exist, rather than this one that has only 3.
Yeah, well, so I would say that there just provides no reason for it. And either if God has these properties, his essential properties necessarily, he either has them necessarily or he doesn't. And so we have to say, okay, is this necessarily existing quad personal being exists or this tripersonal being exists? Well, in order to explain the property, self-giving cooperative love, to do the explanation there, you just need 3 persons. You have no reason actually to add any more, given the principle of simplicity We should prefer simplicity because I think in some sense, I'm not going to specify which, God is simple in some sense. And so we should prefer than simpler explanations. And we find that I think that that's why we as human beings prefer simplicity in selecting scientific theories and metaphysical theories. So I think that's ingrained in human intuitions, and so why we prefer a simple explanation as opposed to a complex explanation of the property cooperative self-giving love.
Okay, I think I agree that it's more reasonable to believe in three since we only just have reason for three. But my problem is if you put that into the ontological argument, I can't see why the argument.
I'm not putting it as part of the ontological argument. I'm just using that as a bridge to connect to Christianity.
Oh, sure. I'm saying, well, if the argument could be used to argue for this being that we know doesn't exist, then that would be a problem.
Yeah, and I don't think you can do that actually. So I think we're on good grounds. Or I've not been given any reason to think that it would. So I mean, I'm fairly comfortable there.
Okay.
But I think you're asking very good questions, to help wrestle through this and make it your own thought process. So I think I commend you for that, teasing out these implications. Yeah.
Worried on how we can justify premise one. Like, how do we know that this is possible rather than another thing? My original.
Oh, you mean quasi? You're going back to that? Yeah.
My original thought is that we would have to look at what God is in fact in the actual world to determine what's possible, since whatever he is necessarily. But if we do that, then we don't have an a priori argument anymore.
Well, yeah, it doesn't. You can use other theistic arguments to justify the possibility premise. You could do that. People have done that. Yeah. I think Craig kind of goes there. Yeah. But I don't think you need to. But I think you can do both or either. And as long as you grant that premise and you're able to generate the rest.
Okay. Yeah, I have a friend who was talking about this argument this week. One thing that he brought up was, yeah, sure, we can give all these other arguments for God's existence to support premise one. It's just, if we need to prove God's existence otherwise, then I don't see why the argument has value.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So I would say it has value because of the arguments I gave for it being possible. But two, I would also say that there's a cost for atheism. Atheists can't say it's possible that God exists, but I don't believe it. You have to increase the intellectual price tag of atheism and make them say, no, it's impossible that God exists. So thereby making atheism less palatable.
Okay. Well, thank you, man. Probably just keep wrestling with this for a while.
No, it's good. Yeah. So I would say I still stand by the original reasons given for it being possible. And I would also say this does increase the intellectual price tag of atheism. Atheists, well, it's possible. Maybe God exists. I don't know. But I just don't think he exists in this way that things have gone.
All right. Well, Nate, you did a great job, my friend. You always do.
Thank you. I've enjoyed time we've had and great questions and great discussion.
We need to get Sean on here and doing some stuff as well.
I was just going to say, I asked you. Didn't I ask you? And you're too busy for us, I think, Sean.
I don't know if you asked. I
think I did. But yeah,
maybe I was in that thing. I remember you guys asking him something, but
we'd love to have you on, man.
It's quite talented. I've read your dissertation, I think, twice, Sean. So.
Oh, really? Okay. Right.
Just in case you weren't unsure if anybody's ever read it, I read it twice.
Oh wow!
Thank you.
And Christian's our chapter president at Winthrop, so he's the next up and coming.
Sean and Nate Taylor.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he's going to be on you guys' level soon.
Yeah.
Sounds like he's doing some great thinking.
He is.
All right. Well, Melissa, do you know what's next week?
Oh.
Off the top of your head?
I don't. I do, but I don't. I forgot.
We'll put it out there.
Yeah.
But appreciate everybody for tuning in, and check on our YouTube channel, Ratio Christi at Winthrop. And go ahead.
I put the link in the chat notes.
Yep, and we'll have it uploaded tonight, and look forward to continuing the discussion on a different
Glenn
topic.
had something. Glenn,
go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah, one more thing. This will be quick. This will be like less than 60 seconds.
Yeah.
So the gentleman who runs Ratio Christi here in Utah, Aaron Marshall,
Yes.
in case everyone's interested, he has a podcast called The Present Day Saint, and he basically just goes over and talks about what he's doing to try to grow Ratio Christi here in Utah, and gives his views on apologetics and stuff like that. So if anyone's interested in hearing on how an evangelical Christian is doing in Utah and trying to grow the faith here and in our colleges, I recommend you all listen to his podcast, The Present Day Saint. It's on all the podcast outlets.
Yeah, he's I'm really excited for the work that he's doing. He left North Carolina to head out to Utah and to try to get some grounding there. And we got a little person in the background that's so cute that keeps running behind you, Nate. They're like going in circles. But yeah, he's we actually had a ministry-wide missions trip out there.
Right.
So yeah, it's.
I was there.
Were you there?
You.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, I saw the group, and I chatted with a lady about. Yeah, and he brought Tim Stratton with him. Very good apologist.
Yeah.
Love him.
Yeah, I'm really excited for the future of RC out there in Utah, and to see it grow in that. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry,
all right.
That up.
No, thanks for bringing that up, Glenn. Always want people to be familiar with the Ratio Christi chapters. If you're out there watching this in YouTube land, check your local university and see if you guys have a Ratio Christi chapter. Good chances you probably do. I think we've got like close to 300 chapters, so they're all over the place. So, Nate, good job. Thank you again for everybody for joining us, and look forward to seeing you all next week. God bless.
All right. See you guys.
Take care.
God bless.
God bless.